The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker,
Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
I'm delighted to tell the Minister that the Labour opposition will be supporting the introduction of this bill. We're absolutely delighted to see it introduced into the House. The decisions that underlie the introduction of this bill were taken under a Labour government a number of years ago and were designed as part of a package of measures, one of which was actually passed under the former government, and this bill now adds the final stage to the implementation of the review of financial products and providers as it relates to non-bank deposit takers. Now, Mr Speaker, having been the Minister responsible for the commerce portfolio in the last Labour government, I've always been fascinated with the way that I'm going to say the way the media commentated on the flow of events as they occurred. The review of financial products and providers, which the Minister referred to, was actually a series of 9 discussion documents that were put out to the market at the same time in 2006. And it was actually quite a substantial amount of information to put out at once, and expect all of those engaged in the different components of our financial products and providers market, and expect them to be able to contribute to the design of what we are seeing part of here today. And what amazed me was that just after the original 9 documents were put out into the marketplace, the first 3 of the finance companies that were to fail actually failed, and that was in 2006. And those 3 companies failed, and I kind of thought that myself, as Minister of Commerce, that we were going to see the domino effect flowing on from that. And I must admit to several sleepless nights at the time, thinking that was the beginning of the end. But actually, it stopped at that point. But then I'd completely forgotten the reality that people who'd invested in finance companies had done so for a fixed period of time as part of the promised return on their investment, most of which were grossly underpriced, which I'll come to in a minute. But the bottom line was that for a lot of people, they were actually just holding their money in finance companies until the very moment at which they could pull their money out and get it into safe territory as quickly as possible. And so when the government received the cabinet paper that I presented to them in 2007 as Minister of Commerce with a series of recommendations about how we might proceed with the review of financial products and providers, the cabinet agreed to all of those decisions in mid-June, and then at the beginning of July, that's when Bridgecorp fell. And Bridgecorp actually was the beginning of the series of dominoes that became actually something that will never leave my mind, because all of those companies that failed took money from the hands of ordinary New Zealanders who had no idea the level of risk that they were taking with their hard-earned money, and a lot of them with money that they'd saved up more than for a rainy day, but actually money that they'd set aside to support their retirement in a fashion to which they wanted to aspire to. And it was just tragic, and there is nothing that will ever make up for me how I felt as a Minister of Commerce, completely powerless to do anything about something that really had been set in train a long time before the review of the products and providers had reported. Mr Speaker, unfortunately, when matters shift from the specialist pages of our business, or the specialist business pages of our newspapers, through to the front page headlines, things get lost in translation. And I think a lot of investors could be forgiven for believing that there was no regulatory framework in place at all before the finance companies fell. And they could also be forgiven for believing that the government only acted because the finance companies fell. In actual fact, a lot of hard work had gone into the fact that we inherited a regulatory wasteland when we became the government in 1999, and we had to do a lot of work to actually get things up to speed, and it did take too long, and I will accept that it did take too long, and the price that ordinary New Zealanders paid for that, unsophisticated investors paid for that, was too high. So I totally accept that. And I also think that the media probably did the public a disservice by implying that there was no attention being paid to this important matter before the finance companies fell. In actual fact, we'd made the decisions around the review of financial products and providers, as I say, several weeks before Bridgecorp fell. The purpose of the review of financial products and providers and the process that we adopted were all aimed to strengthening the regulatory environment in order to promote confidence and therefore increase participation in sound and efficient financial markets. And I think what the government has done here is to actually leverage off the work that we commenced and actually ensure that it is able to deliver on those ambitions, as it were. I've used what occurred to remind people, and I want to remind people again, that governments cannot regulate to eliminate risk. Risk is actually what drives our financial markets, but it has to be risk that is real, and it has to have a degree of reality for those that are going to be investing their hard-earned money. So what happened in the earlier part of this century is that we had finance companies who mispriced the risk, deliberately mispriced the risk, and used well-known figures to stand in front of their product and to basically say to unsophisticated investors, you are essentially putting your money in something that is the equivalent of a bank deposit, because in fact the rate of return was very, very similar to a bank rate of return. So it actually underplayed the degree of risk that people were paying. And I think that it's really important that people realise that the problem that we suffered from a few years ago with the collapse of the finance companies cannot be sheeted home to a previous government that didn't regulate at all, or to the government that started the regulatory process. But I think that I do think that the lack of a strong regulatory framework was part of the problem. But I don't think we should ever get away from the fact that there were people who knew perfectly well what they were doing, who took advantage of the naivety of those who were prepared to put their money into something that would give them a little bit more of a return than a bank deposit. And I don't think we should ever lose sight of that fact. There were other people out there in the marketplace, insufficiently regulated, who actually took advantage of that situation, and people lost a lot of money. So this Labour opposition will support very much this piece of legislation. It strengthens the arm of the Reserve Bank, and I want to congratulate the government on the quality of the regulatory impact statement that actually accompanies this particular bill. It actually makes a nice change to be able to read a regulatory impact statement that is of such high quality, probably because it's come from the Treasury rather than some of the other departments that have been responsible. But the reality is that what it has done is that it has defined the status quo, it has defined the problem, it has looked at a variety of options. One of the options is to look at the banking regime, the other is to look at the insurance regime, the other is to look at a hybrid regime. Other options look at whether we recalibrate the banking regime, and what they've come up with is a very sensible solution, which I think we're going to have no problem supporting as it proceeds through this House. So we will be supporting its transmission to a select committee, and we look forward to their report back to the House.
I call the honourable member